Hello listeners, I've been thinking about Sweden and why Sweden is in such dire straits. Now, Sweden is often considered by many on the right to be at the forefront of pretty much everything that's wrong with the West. Of course, those on the left often tout Sweden as being a sort of a magical fantasy land of socialist and multicultural wonderment. But as you will see, I think, throughout the remainder of this talk, when I present you with some information, Sweden is actually in quite a bit of trouble. Now, specifically, I've been thinking about Sweden's educational system. And there has been a fair amount of hand-wringing over the past few years about Sweden's educational system because it has declined quite severely over the past decade or two. So specifically, I decided to look at the PISA results, and I'll explain what PISA is in a second. I had previously looked at Sweden's PISA results just briefly on a couple of occasions, but I decided to do a more in-depth exploration and analysis of them, which is what I will show you today. So let me define what PISA is, in case you don't know about PISA. I've taken this definition directly from the Wikipedia page. So here we go. The Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, is a worldwide study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in member and non-member nations of 15-year-old school pupils' scholastic performance on mathematics, science, and reading. And I should just add there that in 2003 they also conducted a problem-solving test, but they only did that in 2003. I'm not sure why it was only in that year. So I'll ignore the results from that particular test. Let me continue. It was first performed in 2000 and then repeated every 3 years. It is done with a view to improving education policies and outcomes. It measures problem solving and cognition in daily life. 470,000 15-year-old students, representing 65 nations and territories, participated in PISA 2009. An additional 50,000 students, representing 9 nations, were tested in 2010. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the remainder of this talk is two things. Firstly, I will look at the Swedish results in a little bit of detail, and then I will compare the average Swedish results to those of other nations over time. Alright, so I have prepared a number of graphs for you to consider. Let's have a look at the first one. This one is Swedish PISA results from 2000 to 2012. On the x-axis you can see we have years, and on the y-axis you can see scores. And there are 4 lines. The red line is mathematics, the green line is science, the blue line is reading, and the yellow line is the average of the other 3 tests or lines. So you can see that between 2000 and 2003 there was a slight decline in Sweden's performance. You probably couldn't have made very much of that at the time because, of course, things fluctuate, and that wasn't a very significant decline. However, from 2003 to 2009, it soon became apparent that there was a trend. And not only was Sweden declining, but the rate of decline had accelerated in those years. And then, of course, from 2009 to 2012, that rate of decline accelerated even faster. So you can see that it doesn't look very good for Sweden. Okay, let's have a look at the next graph. So this one is Swedish PISA results from 2000 to 2012, and it's the placings. So on the x-axis, again we have the years, and we also have the number of participating nations. So in 2000 there were 41 participating nations, and in 2003 there were 40. And then in 2006, it's a little bit strange. Basically, what's going on there is that for the mathematics and science tests, there were 57 nations that participated. There were only 56 for the reading test. The USA didn't participate in the reading test. I'm not sure why that was, but it's actually not relevant to the rest of the analysis. And then in 2009 and 2012, that's straightforward. Now the y-axis is a little bit strange. I didn't do this in Microsoft Excel for two reasons. Firstly, I'm not very au fait with Microsoft Excel, and secondly, my version is actually in Chinese, which compounds the problem. So I just used a free graphing program off the internet, and unfortunately I couldn't flip the y-axis because those are places from essentially first to last. And what you should do then is imagine those curves being inverted, the y-axis being inverted, so the curve should go to the right and downwards instead of to the right and upwards. But what you can see there is that Sweden was in the top third or quarter of nations in 2000, but by 2012 it was actually in the bottom half, which is a very severe decline. And it's actually worse than it appears at first. And the reason for that is this. In 2000, those 41 participating nations were almost entirely other developed nations. So Western and Northern European nations, North American, Antipodean and East Asian nations, and then with a smattering of other countries from other parts of the world, developing nations. So Sweden was actually doing okay relative to its peers. It was actually doing okay. However, by 2012, those additional nations that joined, also in 2009, I suppose, of those, the overwhelming majority of the newcomers were developing nations, and yet Sweden still lost ground. So it not only lost ground relative to its peers in the West and East Asia, but it also lost ground to many developing nations that entered the program, which is not very good, obviously. Now let's have a look at the next graph. This one is Swedish PISA results, 2000 to 2012, and it's the comparative changes in scores. So the x-axis is straightforward. The y-axis is a percentage, and it's Sweden's score as a percentage of its 2000 score. So what that means is I took the scores in 2003, 2006 and so on, and I divided those by the scores in 2000, having assigned a value of 100 to the scores in 2000. So I wanted to calculate basically had the scores improved or declined over time, and as you can see, they've declined. And again, in 2003, the decline was fairly minor. You wouldn't really have been too worried about that. But by 2012, Sweden had basically lost about 6 to 7% of its proficiency, I suppose, on every test, which is quite dramatic, especially because many other nations actually improved their scores over that time. So let's have a look at the next graph. This one is Swedish PISA results from 2000 to 2012, and it's the comparative changes in placings. Now this is a little bit strange, this metric, but I wanted to be able to quantify this issue. So again, the x-axis is fairly straightforward, and what I have done on the y-axis is I calculated Sweden's place as a percentage of the first place nation, if you like. So how I did that was I took the number of participating nations, so that's 41, and in 2000, and I subtracted pardon me, I subtracted Sweden's score or placing, if you like, from the number of participating nations. So for instance, in 2000, if we look at the red line, which is mathematics, Sweden placed 16th that year. So I subtracted 16 from 41 to arrive at 25, and then I divided that number by the number of participating nations again. So 25 divided by 41, and as you can see, it's 60.98. And I did that with all of the other scores in every year as well. So what you can see is that Sweden sort of held its own for basically the first decade. It was more or less in the top third, approximately, for that time. However, after 2009, that is the 2012 test, something very dramatic occurred, and Sweden fell off a cliff and basically fell into the bottom half. As you can see, all of those scores are in the 40s. So that's not very good. Alright, now let's move on to the second half of my comparisons and analyses and so on. What I have done here is I'm going to compare Sweden to various other groups of nations. So what I have done is I've assigned different nations to particular groups, basically by sort of geographic or economic status, and I've plotted their scores, just their average scores, alongside Sweden's average scores. And I could only plot 5 nations on these graphs because of the limitations of the program I used. So what I want you to do, before I actually show you each graph, I'm going to read the list of the nations that will appear on that graph, and I want you to just spend a few moments considering those nations and considering Sweden, and how you think those other nations might perform relative to Sweden. Okay, so the first graph will have Nordic nations. The Nordic nations are as follows: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and of course Sweden, being a Nordic nation itself. The Faroe Islands are also Nordic nations, but they didn't participate. Okay, so one more time: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. Okay, let's have a look at that graph. So you can see from here on out, for all of these graphs, the x and y axes are basically going to be the years on the x axes for every graph, and the scores, the average scores, on the y axes for each graph. So we have Denmark in red, Finland in green, Iceland in blue, Norway in yellow, and Sweden in pink. Okay, so let's have a look at Finland first. Now, Finland has often been considered the poster child for the Western educational system because the other nations that have performed really well in the world have been East Asian nations, and people have used Finland as an example of a different system. They say, well, the East Asian nations perform very well, but they really sort of grind their children into the ground in order to get such fantastic results. Whereas Finland has this very lovely, touchy-feely, cuddly, kissy system. It's wonderful. So you don't have to put your kid in an educational sweatshop, so to speak, to educate them well. So, as you can see, Finland has always been, and still is, way ahead of the other Nordic nations. And you can see that for the first 3 tests, Finland did very well. In fact, Finland was actually number 1 in the world between 2000 and 2006, and everyone was in love with Finland in those years. However, after 2006, Finland has declined to the point where it's actually below where it began in 2000. Nevertheless, it's still very highly ranked. In fact, Finland is number 7 in the world still. So it's declined from number 1 to number 7, which is still pretty good, but it's a little bit worrying. Okay, now let's look at the other nations. So Sweden is in pink, and Sweden began at the head of the other nations other than Finland. It's now at the end, at the back. It's now the worst performing nation out of all of the Nordic nations. Let's look at the blue line, which is Iceland. Now Iceland has declined as well, though not as dramatically as Sweden, but nevertheless it has declined. And then Norway and Denmark, there's been a slight amount of volatility, but they've basically finished in 2012, or they finished in 2012, where they began in 2000, more or less. The changes have been very slight. So, another thing I want you to consider, however, is that if you examine the difference in scores in 2000 between Sweden in pink and Denmark in red, that difference was 16 points. If you now look at those two nations' scores in 2012, again, the difference is 16 points. However, whereas it was plus 16 for Sweden in 2000, it's now minus 16 for Sweden in 2012. So they have essentially reversed positions, which is not very good. Sweden is not performing well relative to any of its peers, its closest peers. But it gets worse. Let's consider the next graph. Okay, so this one is going to be Sweden versus the pigs. The pigs was a rather disparaging name given to mostly Southern European nations plus Ireland. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, because those nations all experienced quite severe economic downturns. They had housing busts and so on, and some of them are still really suffering. So the pigs then, the acronym comes from Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain. So I'm actually not going to use Italy because its results were fairly similar to Portugal's. So I would have been doubling up in effect. So the nations I'm going to use in alphabetical order are Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and of course Sweden. So I want you to think about those. I'll say them one more time. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain. Okay, let's have a look at the graph. So, the red line is Greece, the green line is Ireland, the blue line is Portugal, the yellow line is Spain, and the pink line is Sweden. Now you can see that initially, and for much of the decade, Ireland and Sweden tracked one another. I actually think that the score for Ireland in 2009 was slightly strange. I'm not sure if that was to do with the global financial crisis or not, but basically that was well below average for Ireland. Nevertheless, Ireland basically went nowhere in the 12 years that they've gone nowhere in the 12 years that they've participated in this test. They began on 514 and they're now on 515. Sweden, on the other hand, has declined, and after 2009, Ireland and Sweden's fortunes diverged. Let's look at the next line, which is yellow for Spain. Now again, Spain, it dipped a little bit, but it's basically where it began. So it began on 487 in 2000, and it's now on 489. So it's only moved up by 2 points. But interestingly there, it's actually overtaken Sweden. Now I think that if you had said in 2000 that Spain would overtake Sweden within 12 years, I don't think people would have believed you. And indeed, I've actually been to both of those nations, and Sweden does look quite different to Spain. It looks far more developed than Spain. So the fact that Sweden has declined so markedly in those 12 years and has been overtaken by Spain, I think is really telling. Let's look at the next line, which is blue for Portugal. Now, Portugal has performed phenomenally. As you can see, it's really increased quite a lot. And again, it's actually overtaken Sweden, which is very, very dramatic. And if you consider that enormous gap that was in place in 2000, because it was 52 points different, and now Portugal is in front by 6 points. That's a phenomenal improvement by Portugal, although it's also a phenomenal decline by Sweden. And again, I don't think anyone would have believed you if you had said back then that Portugal would overtake Sweden within 12 years. And the final line is Greece, which is in red. Now, Sweden is still ahead of Greece by 16 points, though if you look at the difference in 2000, Greece and Portugal began the same on 461. So Greece has closed the gap of 52 points down to only 16 points. Now, Greece doesn't look like it's really improved very much. The trend might be slightly upwards, but it's a little bit hard to say because it's very volatile. But nevertheless, if Greece does nothing from this point out, if it simply stagnates, Sweden is heading to it. And I don't think it's inconceivable that within, well, probably not by 2015, but within the next few years, perhaps 2018 or 2021, that Sweden could be basically at the same point that Greece is at. And again, if you had said in 2000 that within, say, 20 years, Greece and Sweden would be in the same situation, I don't think people would have believed you. And they might have believed you even less after the global financial crisis, because if you say to people now the word Greece, that word conjures up images of a nation that is fundamentally broken. Really, really broken. It's in really dire straits. There's all sorts of pain and suffering in Greece. And to suggest that within another 10, well, not even 10 years, that Sweden educationally may be in the same boat as Greece is absolutely mind-blowing, really. And I think it's really just evidence of the tragic case of Sweden. But the horror story does not end there. Let's continue. The next graph I'm going to show you is of the Baltic countries. And by Baltic, I'm specifically referring to the three small nations at the eastern end of the Baltic Sea, former Soviet nations. Those are both from north to south and also alphabetically: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So think about those three nations. I'll say them again: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So let's examine those nations' performances. Okay, the first thing I need to tell you is that the scores were not actually flat for Estonia and Lithuania for those 6 years at the beginning. Estonia and Lithuania did not begin these tests until 2006, but this program wouldn't allow me to leave the scores for 2000 and 2003 blank, so I just took their 2006 scores and moved them backwards as well. So you can see Estonia is in red, Latvia is in green, Lithuania is in blue, and Sweden is in yellow. Now, what do we see here? Well, Estonia actually entered the program not only above Sweden in that particular year, but above Sweden's performance in any year, which is quite dramatic, I think. Now, Estonia has often been considered to be a sort of a mini Finland. I think it is different to Latvia and Lithuania. It's certainly different ethnically and linguistically. It's actually in the same. The Estonian language is in the same family group, language family group as Finnish, and ethnically they're related to Finns, so they are different. And I went to all three of those Baltic nations in 2002 and also in 2003, and I did notice that the culture and the level of infrastructure and all sorts of things were different in Estonia to those in Latvia and Lithuania, and it did seem like a sort of a lesser version of Finland, in fact, based upon my travels to Finland also. And I think it's actually likely that Estonia will it will continue to become more like a Nordic nation rather than an Eastern European nation. And indeed, Estonia is now actually in the top 8. It's number 8 in the world after Finland. And I should just say the first 6 are all East Asian nations. So it's essentially the second Western nation in the world now, just behind Finland. It's only 3 points behind Finland in the world. So Estonia is basically becoming an extremely modern, developed Western nation and so on, certainly educationally, which is phenomenal, really, when you consider it was part of the Soviet Union only a generation ago. All right, but let's go back to the graph and consider the other two nations, Latvia and Lithuania. So Lithuania is in blue, and Latvia is in green, and you can see that both of those nations have also overtaken Sweden, not by that much, but they appear to be trending upwards, whilst Sweden is trending downwards. I don't know if any of these trends will continue for any of the nations I present to you here, but all we can do is look at the trends, and Sweden has been overtaken by all three of the Baltic nations, which is not very good. It's very sad for Sweden, but the sadness does not end there. Let's look at the next graph. Before I show you this graph, let me tell you the nations. They're going to be Eastern European nations. Now, I haven't included every Eastern European nation, I've only included 4. But those 4 are quite interesting in and of themselves, and they somewhat represent trends that are occurring in Eastern Europe. So the 4 nations we have are Bulgaria, Poland, Russia, and Serbia. And I think Bulgaria and Serbia serve as good proxies for, let's say, the southern Slavic nations, the southern Eastern European nations. Poland serves as a good proxy for the Central European or the Western Slavic nations in Eastern Europe. Russia, perhaps for the Eastern Slavic nations, the easternmost Eastern European nations. And they are sort of the best of those particular subgroups. But nevertheless, I think they're indicative of what's happening in those sub-regions of Eastern Europe. So we have Bulgaria so I'll just say those nations again so you can consider them. Bulgaria, Poland, Russia, and Serbia. So let's examine the graph. So the first one is, we have Bulgaria in red, Poland in green, Russia in blue, and Serbia in yellow, and Sweden in pink. So let's have a look. So you can see Sweden's decline, as always. Now Poland has performed exceptionally well. You can see there it's really gone upwards. Indeed, Poland is actually number 12 in the world now. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the first 6 nations are East Asian, and then in number 10 we have Macau as well. So 7 of those top 12 nations are East Asian, and then there are only 5 non-East Asian nations there, and Poland is number 12. So Poland has really performed quite admirably. It's really phenomenal. I don't know what they've been doing in Poland, but that's very good, their result. And you can see there that they have really diverged from Sweden. Now, to offer you an anecdote about this, I went to Poland in 2003, and it was really different to Sweden. Back then, I went to Sweden in 2002. It was dramatically different to Sweden. And I'll give you a little story about this. I was in a town or a city called Toruń, I think it's pronounced, in northern Poland. And I was in the sort of the non-touristy part of the town. It has a little medieval town square and all of that kind of stuff. But I was in the outskirts, and I observed a father and son arrive at a construction site. There was a sort of an overpass or something being built, and I arrived there, and I observed a father and son arrive in a van, and they then proceeded to strip the construction site of scrap metal, essentially wire, pipes, and anything they could find at this construction site. It was a sort of a post-apocalyptic scene, actually. It was quite interesting to observe that. So that's a snapshot of Poland from 2003. Now, I mean, obviously, it's not necessarily indicative of Poland as a whole, but Poland was dramatically less developed than Sweden back then, and yet now, or in 2012, Poland found itself ahead by 39 points, which is quite dramatic. It's further evidence of Sweden's tragic demise. Now let's look at the next line. Oh, sorry, and I just want to add, how much longer will it be really until Poland reaps the benefits of this and essentially becomes a very important nation? I think its population is approximately 40 million people, so that's quite sizable. That puts it, I think, within the top 5 or 6 nations in terms of population in Europe. You've got Germany, France, the UK, Spain and Italy. So yeah, I think it's about number 6, excluding Russia and the Ukraine. So, I mean, it's going to be a force to be reckoned with, surely. Now let's look at the next line, which is blue, which is Russia. Now, Russia has only improved slightly, and it's slightly deceptive on that graph. I don't know why it appears that Sweden is in front, but it's actually Russia. Russia is on 484, and Sweden is on 482. Now, as I said before, if you had said in the year 2000 that Russia, which wasn't that far behind Sweden, but nevertheless it was behind them, if you had said that Russia, which was emerging from a rather dramatic decade, remember the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and then there was a big financial crisis in Russia, I think in 1998, 97 or 98. But nevertheless, that was a very rocky decade for Russia. I mean, Russia's always had quite a dramatic history, and the 20th century as a whole was quite dramatic, but the 1990s were quite severe. If you had said in 2000 that within 12 years Russia would be ahead of Sweden, I don't think people would have believed you. Now, of course, Russia is a very complex nation. It's had a very interesting history, as I just mentioned, but it's also it has some sort of structural disadvantages, I think. For instance, it's a huge country, so you have people spread out all over the place, often in quite remote areas as well, and it's also very ethnically diverse. So I imagine running some sort of national education program there is quite a formidable task. So given that Russia, with those issues, has managed to overtake Sweden, I think that's quite dramatic. Now, let's examine the other two lines, red for Bulgaria and yellow for Serbia. Those two nations have been fairly similar. Now, Sweden is still ahead of them. However, if you consider the difference between Sweden and Serbia in 2000, that difference has essentially halved in the subsequent 12 years. Even if Serbia and Bulgaria, which have improved slightly, but not an enormous amount, but even if they just stagnate from here on out, if Sweden continues as it has been doing, quite probably within another 12 years, it will find itself in the esteemed company of Bulgaria and Serbia. And I think if you had suggested to people in the year 2000 that within a quarter century, Sweden might very well find itself within the company of Bulgaria and Serbia, I do not think they would have believed you. And I've been to both of those countries, and they are very much a step down from other Eastern European countries. The Western and Eastern, they're more northerly neighbours, be they Poland or Russia, to both of which I have visited. And I think that people would not have believed you. Now, that's not a foregone conclusion, because they're not there yet, or Sweden is not there yet, but the trend suggests that it might arrive there, which is rather tragic. Now, let's have a look at the remaining graph, the final graph. This graph is going to be essentially between Sweden and nations from other parts of the world, so non-European nations. So I'll tell you those three nations first: Chile, Turkey, and Vietnam. So one more time: Chile, Turkey, and Vietnam. Let's have a look at the graph. Now, I've titled this Sweden versus the best of the developing world. I think Chile is technically not a developing nation anymore. It's in the OECD. And I'm not sure if Turkey is, but I think it will be quite soon. Vietnam is not, I believe. Before I actually examine each of those nations' performances, let me just point some things out. As occurred with some of the Baltic nations, these three nations did not participate in every test. So Vietnam actually has only participated in the 2012 test. So I had to fill in the blanks with its score from that year. Likewise, Chile participated in 2000, but not in 2003, and then has participated from 2006 onwards. Turkey, that's correct. Turkey only entered in 2003, so I had to fill in the blanks there for both of those nations. So let's look at Vietnam first. Now, we only have a single data point, but nevertheless, as was the case with Estonia, Vietnam entered this program not only higher than Sweden's score for that year, and there was a huge gap there, as you can see, but also higher than Sweden's best ever score. So let me say a few things about Vietnam. Geographically, Vietnam is within Southeast Asia, and to some extent I'm using this as a proxy for Southeast Asia, although the other Southeast Asian nations are sort of languishing quite far down the list, and they're not really improving very much. I think Vietnam is slightly different to that. Although it's geographically within Southeast Asia, I don't think it's really culturally within Southeast Asia. Firstly, there's a mountain range that runs down the border, the western border of Vietnam, which is the border with Laos primarily, and that seems to act actually as quite an interesting natural barrier. And then there's the Mekong Delta in the south, which again forms part of a barrier, I think. Ethnically, they do look quite different to other Southeast Asians, and culturally they're different too. I believe Vietnam shares a lot more in common with East Asian nations than it does with other Southeast Asian nations, in the same way that Singapore does, actually. And Vietnam was ruled for approximately 1,000 years by China, so it was heavily Sinicized for a long part of its modern history, or recent history. So I actually expect Vietnam will continue to trend upwards, and Vietnam is actually ranked number 15th in the world. So I think it will sort of go up towards East Asian nations, though they're considerably in front of it. But I expect it will continue to trend upwards. Now let's just skip over Turkey for a moment. Let's look at Chile. I've taken Chile as a sort of a proxy for the Latin American countries. Now Chile is considerably in front of the other Latin American countries. It's the best of the Latin American countries, basically. Now you can see that the Chile experienced an increase, and it seems to have plateaued for the past few years. I don't know if that will continue, but let's assume that it has and will. Again, as with some other nations, so Bulgaria and Serbia, I'm thinking of, even if Chile really does nothing, if it does stagnate, Sweden appears to be going towards it, and it's not inconceivable, considering the decline of Sweden and the improvement for Chile, that perhaps within 12 years, Sweden could find itself alongside Chile. Now, as I said, Chile is way out in front of most other, or all, I believe, all other Latin American nations. But nevertheless, Sweden might find itself, rather than in the company of other Nordic nations and other Western European nations and so on, it might find itself having more in common with Latin American nations, which is dramatic, obviously. Let's now look at the blue line, which represents Turkey. And I think this comparison between Turkey and Sweden is perhaps the most significant of all of the comparisons that I've shown. Because if you imagine that graph continuing to 2015, so this year, they will conduct tests this year. If you look at where those two lines are heading, they will basically touch, give or take. They will touch in 2015 if present trends continue. So Sweden will become Turkey and Turkey will become Sweden. That's quite significant, really. And that leads me on to ask the question, why has this happened to Sweden? What's going on in the tragic case of Sweden? Well, if Sweden is becoming Turkey and Turkey is becoming Sweden, there is a rather large elephant in the room. Whenever people discuss these kinds of issues, they'll offer all sorts of other explanations, but there's a rather large elephant in the room that is never discussed in the mainstream media, and certainly not on the left. Now, it's obviously a very important topic to those of us on the right, and you know what I'm going to say. It's immigration, and emigration also. You are what you eat, and you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So the migratory trends for Sweden have been that indigenous Swedes have left Sweden for greener pastures, wherever those might be, Canada, the US, maybe some other Western European nations. I don't think there are many in Australia. But nevertheless, native Swedes have fled the country, only to have been replaced, and not just in the numbers that they left, but in greater numbers, by people from other parts of the world, primarily the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and places like Somalia as well. Now, if they were only from Turkey, you might say, well, that would be bad enough, but Turkey is improving. But nevertheless, they would become more like Turkey and less like Sweden. That country would become less like Sweden. However, they're not only coming from Turkey, they're coming from countries that have performed far worse than Turkey. And so, if Sweden wants to invite people from that part of the world into Sweden, it should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone, and yet, of course, it does, or rather, it's the elephant in the room that no one discusses. But it should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone that Sweden will come to resemble those countries from which its immigrants hail. Now, the other issue, of course, with Sweden is that those of us on the right often talk about how Sweden is right at the cutting edge of basically all that is wrong with the West. All of the craziest ideas and social policies, laws, and so on seem to be way out on the farthest leftmost edge for Sweden. And it's almost like a little test tube of what you can do wrong with a nation, how you can sabotage a society. Now, these two issues, be they immigration or crazy leftist social policies, either one might not be sufficient to completely destroy a country. But in conjunction, they seem to be doing that. It might be that a nation could have some crazy ideas, and it could implement those, and experience perhaps a slight decline, or hold steady, at least for a while, until older generations died off, and the newer generations who had grown up under those crazy ideas replaced them. That might be the case by itself. They could hold out for a while. Likewise, it might be the case that a nation could hold out for a while with some immigration, but eventually it would experience a decline. But it would take some time for that to filter through. But in conjunction, these two things seem to be absolutely running amok in Swedish society, as these results bear out. And it's really quite tragic. It's a terribly sad situation. I've been to Sweden twice, and it's a lovely country, beautiful country in terms of the landscape and so on, and the architecture and all of that. The people are fantastic. They're so civilized and polite, and it's just really advanced. It's all that stuff that leftists say about Scandinavia and the Nordic countries in general. That it's this sort of utopian place, but it's changing. And something I should say also is that, remember at the beginning of this talk I mentioned that the students who were tested are 15-year-olds. So those students who were tested in 2000 were children who had been born in 1985. The students who were tested in 2012 were students who had been born in 1997. Likewise, the students who will be tested this year were students who were born in 2000. And obviously, so on and so forth into the future. Now, the Swedish immigration policy and the Swedish other policies have only become crazier in the past 10 to 15 years. They haven't got better than they were in 1985. They have got worse. They're worse than they were in 1997. Pardon me. Now, what would that tend to suggest? That if anything, this problem will only get worse, and Sweden will likely decline. We will see after they conduct the tests this year and again in 3 years and 3 years after that and so on, but it does not look good to me. If I were a betting man, I would bet things would get worse rather than better. And this leads me to my final question, with which I will leave you. Given these trends that we have seen, and given how mathematics and science proficiency and education and intelligence in general, remember everyone always talks about this information economy and all of this sort of stuff, given that these issues are likely to become far more important in the future than they are now and have been, and given that people say that these things will be necessary for a nation to remain wealthy and therefore to be able to fund its programs, its welfare programs, and its infrastructure even, given these things, for how much longer will Sweden remain a comparatively developed nation? Thank you for listening.